Forward on the clock. There we go. It's all you, Bren.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, welcome everybody. So this is a lunch and learn session, or an enablement session that we basically put together real quick for agile project management. And really, what's sort of driving this is several reasons, multifold really. One, we created a specific plan SKU that we're not going to sell to ultimate users that are not technical, that are not using the source code management functionality or the security functionality. They're going to be primarily focused on using, GitLab to basically manage boards, manage sprints. So this is something that has been made available. We're really as part of the Atlassian takeout play. We're going after that market where we're going to have more and more people basically converting over to GitLab Plan. And so this is sort of a refresher on how to use that functionality. I'm going to lead off with sort of just giving a real quick, overview of how usually agile projects are organized and sort of some of the terminology and how that also maps into GitLab. And then Max is gonna take over and sort of do a little demo hands-on with a GitLab project, just walking us through the functionality. So having said that, I assume everybody can see my screen. If not, speak up. But here we go. So really, when it comes to just agile management, this is sort of the GitLab default. Sometimes we're not quite aware of that because we all work in issues, we create issues, but very often teams, I think especially on the product side, they basically organize everything into sprints or milestones, basically chunks that they can iterate over to basically deliver functionality. And the model is a real simple model. If you go through the numbers here, 1, 2, 5, it's basically you have sprint planning, you have daily stand-ups usually, you go through some review process where you basically prioritize what you have to work on. You continuously refine your backlog, so that's usually a long list of issues. And then you basically assign it to sprints. So, and the reason people have sprints is really, fairly simple. It's just a smaller chunk that you can basically achieve to have some meaningful progress and some deliverable that you can actually measure yourself against, instead of doing the bigger waterfall activity where you really only know that you succeeded way towards the end of the process. So sprints, fancy word for little chunks that you use to basically show progress along the way. So from any kind of engagement, that we do or that a development team might be engaged in or our product folks might be engaged in, there's usually some logical breakdown where you basically have delivery objectives, right? You engage, you plan, you implement, you train, and this is highly dependent on what you actually are doing and what your specific activities are. But when you hear these terminologies, it's still basically is a sprint. It's basically just, and any of these objectives. So for example, the train objective in one customer of ours, it might be 2 or 3 sprints. In another, it might be 1 sprint, or in still another, you might not have any train activities. So so again, an agile sort of iterative model is very flexible, and that's why it's so popular. And that's why we have it in the product, and that's why our product engineers are using it, and that's why many customers are using it. So having said that, doesn't mean that you cannot have traditional sort of waterfallish phase gates, right, that are basically organized in sprints. So I'm just showing here on this slide, you can still have a fairly traditional development model that talks about requirements and project planning and integrations and testing and go live coordination, but it's still, you can still organize it in sprints. So sometimes when I talk to folks, people are like, oh no, that's not agile, or people are like, oh, we don't do that, so don't get confused about the terminology. Same as some people call it a sprint, some people call it iterations. I think, we call it milestones. It's essentially the same. So don't get, confused about terminology. Even like within, I think, the Jira world, depending, if you use Jira out of the box or use Jira Align, there's sometimes, slightly different terminology being used because some of the tooling out there in the market is basically modeled on different, agile methodologies. Usually from an engagement perspective, you go through some kind of discovery, then you basically establish team readiness. Usually you have a sprint 0, and then some people, might call it a kickoff, but it's some setup where you basically start, preparing the team for what has to be done, also making sure that sort of the basics are met. You have, system access, all the team members are present, etc. And then you start sprinting in these chunks of deliverables that you're going to go along. If you look at usually how teams are organized, how Agile is organized, it's very, very simple. It's really just 3 things you have to sort of keep in mind. It's a set of roles, a set of events, and some set of artifacts. So, the roles in our case, just put this in here: architect, program manager, senior PSE, trainer, so these are some of the roles that we're basically prepping for next year. We don't have program managers yet, but, it's that's coming. You have a set of events that, usually people go through when they go through an agile planning process. You do sprint planning, you have, daily stand-ups. Some teams do bi-weekly, some teams do weekly. It really depends on the cadence that you agree to. You go through some kind of refinement process where you look at, all the issues that are in your backlog to determine, if those issues are actually actionable, have enough information. You go through a sprint review. And then ultimately, at the end of every sprint or iteration or milestone, you should actually do some sprint retrospect and say, hey, what worked well, what didn't work well. Especially on longer term projects, that's important. If you have a real short, project where, you basically are done in 4 weeks, those sprint, retrospectives probably aren't that useful. If you're on an engagement that lasts 3, 6, 9 months, then, that's probably more important because you want to make sure that you sort of learn as you go. And a set of artifacts. So again, these are very standard across multiple agile process models, methodologies, whatever you want to call it, Scrum, Safe. There's like at least 5 or 6 popular ones out there. So again, don't get confused about just minor terminology differences. They essentially do all the same. Again, sprint 0 is sort of the setting expectations, getting everybody aligned, and what's most importantly, not just aligned in terms of resources and timelines, but also in terms of expectations. So sprint 0 is usually the first set of sprint activities where you basically make sure you set yourself up for success further down the road, as you start sprinting through multiple sprints. I just, laid out here sort of at a high level, sort of in sample of how this usually works, what's involved, in sprint 0, activities, team mobilization, engagement planning, setup of, technical and business foundational issues, and then ultimately, going to production or delivering the engagement, if that's basically what your focus is. I just walked through. We don't have to go in great detail through this, what's on the slide, but just we'll add it. I think Glenn, you always put together the recording as well as any presentations or whatever as a link, so we'll make this available to you guys afterwards. But it basically really just walks through the steps that I just gave you, sort of high level, an overview for. What I want to stress though is that all agile process models, methodologies basically assume that you go through some kind of a cadence. So for example, a sprint could be 1 week long, it could be 2 weeks long, in some cases even 4 weeks long, depending on your environment and the technical challenges you're trying to solve. So the cadence is important because the cadence basically establishes also sort of a feedback model in terms when things aren't going well or you need to adjust. And that's what the retrospectives are usually there for as well, that you can basically iterate. So the cadence is usually established also in a sprint 0 with the customer or with the project team that you're working on. Excuse me. And it basically is important because ultimately the cadence allows you to layer in how long your project lasts, or if it's an open-ended engagement, which in our case, for example, we do some T&M, right? If you don't have a deadline you have to hit, if it's not, say, May 30th, and you're going to work, then you just schedule sprints as they come along, and you basically work through the highest value items first. And all this is driven through something that in agile parlance is a product backlog. The product backlog is really just a fancy to-do list of issues that you document. Once it's in the product backlog, usually things are assigned to a sprint or a milestone, so it can deliver against those. So it's a running list that basically, as you learn about implementation challenges, you add additional issues. You might, figure out 4 or 6 weeks into a project that, certain things aren't necessary any longer because the situation on the ground changed. So it's important to keep the product backlog basically up to date. And these are basically prioritized. So you have one priority 1 and you have one priority, whatever, 333, which is sometimes hard because what happens is frequently, people, customers, engineers tend to put everything in as a priority 1. But there's usually just one priority 1, and that should all bubble to the top of the backlog. And that prioritization happens in different ways. So, for example, later when Max is going to show us the functionality in GitLab, you can actually order the backlog by dragging and dropping things across columns. So, again, that's basically tells you the priority implicitly. So you don't necessarily need a priority field. You don't necessarily need to say there's a priority 1, 2, 3, 5. You can basically just by the order indicate what the priority is, and any engineer, any project participant should be able to just look at that and say, hey, what's on top is the most important, and that's what we should be working on. The other thing that happens in any kind of agile process model, and we enable the same thing in GitLab Plan, is basically that you can organize things not just by priority, but the sprints implicitly also tell you the business value, because the assumption in agile process models is always that you work on the highest value items first. So you don't work on some low priority issue, in the first sprint. You try to basically tackle the big rocks first, so that you basically start creating business value. The sooner the sooner in the cycle, the better. So, you have really 2 axes. One is basically the priority of your stories or your issues. That's basically prioritized top to bottom. And then, left to right is really the business value that you're organizing into sprints. So, and once this is actually communicated, it becomes very, very simple to manage, projects. And that's basically, we have that as part of our plan functionality. And it's very powerful, and that's why these process models have basically been adopted across many different industries, not just within the software development community. Here's an example. For example, if you do like a movement from on-prem to cloud hosted, and you're like re-architecting your applications, etc., you basically when you have these efforts, what you always try to basically figure out is what are your design objectives. So there's business value that's important for the customers to realize, and that's very often sort of the more MBA focused folks that worry about that stuff. But then there's also the technical perspective that you need to accommodate. And so from an agile process model perspective, you try to basically create business value on the one hand, but you also try to create technical architectures that basically make sure that you're improving on your technical capabilities, you're minimizing maintenance, you're minimizing technical debt. So, here just, again, when you walk through the slides, there are going to be some examples that are like, okay, so keep in mind that an agile process model by itself can't really tell you what the business value is. It can't really tell you what your technical debt is. You basically have to, address those things, when you're on a project or a development effort. So the GitLab plan functionality is really just basically providing you with the mechanics of being able to manage these things. On an engagement or in a development effort, you still basically have to identify those things proactively, and then you manage them with a plan functionality. So just be aware that's basically from an agile sort of sprint planning perspective, the plan functionality. It's very standard what we have. There's a little bit terminology mapping that's going on, which is mentioned on this slide. So again, when you see terminology, you can actually look all that stuff up. Our handbook is pretty well documented that way. This slide just shows you sort of how we map into this agile process model, and that's basically it. It's a very simple model. It's pretty standard. With the plan functionality, what you'll see with the $15 SKU that we created to basically enable GitLab users that aren't technical to use the plan functionality, you will see more and more of these discussions becoming active. We just had a meeting this morning, discussing, one of the customers, that a partner has. They're moving off of Jira into, GitLab. So they're gonna, go through this process of trying to figure out what their current process model is in Jira and how they can map it, into GitLab to basically, keep managing their activities, in an agile way. So that's my portion of the enablement session. I'll hand it over to Max. Max, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. I think I have to stop sharing so you can take over.
Yep.
There you go. There you go. Maybe this is a good break to ask if there's questions. Are there questions? Is everybody on mute? No question.
Just absorbing info, soaking it in.
Okay. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, indeed.
So hi everyone. Today we explore GitLab's plan functionality through a demonstration focused on a project called Taskmaster. Just a little bit of context here. Taskmaster is a task management application. It involves creating, organizing, and tracking tasks efficiently. We cover various aspects like planning work, documentation, issue management, how to use issue boards, and we'll use some time at the end for a Q&A. With that being said, let's start. GitLab has been crafted with the adaptability in mind, okay? That means the platform is flexible enough to adapt to your methodology, whether it's agile or influenced by it. In this demonstration, I will showcase a straightforward alignment of agile concepts with GitLab feature, illustrating how project managers can effectively steer high-performing teams using GitLab functionalities. So with that being said, let's begin with roadmaps. A roadmap within GitLab serves as a scheduled event, effectively communicating planned solution deliverables across planning horizon. You can visualize it as a timeline, as roadmaps exhibit epic timeframes, enabling a clear vision of the project's trajectory. So as you can see here, we can basically see the different timelines, the different milestones that are actually associated to a specific project. Let's deep dive into epics. Epics in GitLab encapsulate various elements. You can consider an epic as a big chunk of work, as Brian was just depicting before, like stories, like big stories or projects. They help describe and gather all the information about this big part of works. Within GitLab, epics function similarly to issues, but offer the ability to attach multiple child issues, creating a hierarchical breakdown. So you can see there's a hierarchy here. So this is actually the main epic. You can have child epics, and you can have, from these child epics, you can have multiple issues. So this approach allows a division of big or very big, large epics, into manageable independent components through child epics and issues. So with that being said, let's go into a specific issue. In Agile, a user story often kickstarts development by capturing a singular feature and adds value for a specific user. GitLab mirror this using issues, okay? They serve as an individual project element capturing business values. So you can have, for a specific issue, you can have its name, you can have its description, you can basically enter what kind of information you, as the mapping said before, an issue represents basically user story, okay? So you can basically have also story points that we also call weight in GitLab. You can have specific due dates, and you can actually also label the issue like to make sure, let's say, for example, later on, you want to make sure you can actually sort your issues more easily because you can use label to do so. And you can also assign a story to a specific member of the team. Within GitLab, epics also function similarly to issues, but offer the unique ability to attach multiple child issues. So you can see here we have child items. We can create what we call task lists, which are actually basically similar to what we call subtasks in Agile project management. And we can basically enable that feature to have a more detailed breakdown of issues into manageable parts. So in this specific case, I didn't create one, but you can actually just create multiple tasks to basically, divide this specific issue called, for example, integrate notification system into smaller tasks that the developer can pick up. Now, okay. Product owners or project managers, right, can use GitLab to articulate business and customer needs, prioritizing them within a backlog to communicate, urgency and desired development sequences. They dynamically generate issues without an associated milestone, serve as the product backlog. Okay, so aiding and tracking tasks. So you can use it, whenever you create a new issue, this is actually what we can call our product backlog. Now, let's go and see what a milestone is. So milestone in GitLab mirror the sprint concept. So in Agile, whenever you actually try to define a sprint, you can actually think about the sprint as a milestone. They define a specific time frame for work completion. So when you assign basically a start date and a due date to milestone, it encapsulates the sprint duration, aiding in organizing and tracking tasks within that specific time frame. Now let's go with this specific time frame. Here you can see what we call it burn down charts into GitLab. Okay, so GitLab burn down charts provide a real-time overview of work in progress within the current sprint. These charts visualize the completion of scope work and they incorporate estimations, typically represented by issue weight or story points, we can say so. meaning estimated efforts. From here, let's talk about what we call also issue boards, because this is also a very important concept. During a sprint, team members actively select and work on assigned issues within GitLab. Okay, so that means an issue means a task, as an assignee that we can actually see here, means that you have actually what we call a task ownership. And the issues traverse through various stages like in progress, review, or done, depending on the particular workflow that your organization defines. GitLab's issue board facilitated the movement of issues through stages, offering configurability based on labels and other pertinent attributes. So, for example, in this specific case, I can basically select a specific issue. I can move it into in progress. I can assign it to myself. I can also assign it to somebody else in the team. I can also see the different labels. Let's say, for example, you can see the status move to in progress automatically. It got labeled automatically. This is what we call an agile issue board. And this is basically where you can actually, assign stories to different people, to different members of the team, track down every single feature that is actually implemented within the current sprint. So working with this Epic board is pretty easy. You can basically just create a list here. You can actually see here by maybe defining, you can specify a specific type of metadata that you want to capture. Let's say, for example, you want to define a new status that is probably done. Once you add it to the board, it goes here. So the specific stories can go through the multiple stages, depending on how the project manager actually, see them. Once the task is done, we can actually move it, we can actually iterate and make sure it actually get closed and get captured properly into the milestone board. So now let's talk about wikis. So GitLab Wiki serves as a valuable repository for documenting and team retrospectives, capturing lessons learned, tracking action items over time. So we can use milestone pages during the retrospective, allowing team to review the sprint's completion status, viewing burn down chart and statistical insight, as I showed before here, right? So you can actually see that GitLab itself can be used as a complete platform for project management, the same way we use Jira. For those who are pretty familiar with Jira, you can actually see it's not that different. You can actually track pretty much everything that you need from here. I think that concludes the little breakdown that I had to showcase, how we can actually go to the plan functionality with GitLab. If there's any question.
Yeah, Max, I have a question. Back in the day when I took my GitLab certification training on the plan feature, dependencies were not supported. Being able to link tasks like you would in, I'll say the blasphemous word, Microsoft Project. Has that been resolved, or and if so, how?
So you're talking about linking tasks, linking issues, right? If I'm not mistaken.
More than linking. So a dependency is not just linked, but this can't start until this is complete, or better yet, this can't start until this is 80% complete, which is very commonly the case as you're doing project management, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so I think I know the answer to that one. I don't think that's functionality that's supported. It's implicit, meaning when you basically organize your issues into epics, right? There is a certain order. Remember when I talked about the backlog, that basically everything is prioritized top to bottom. So for example, if you have a dependency, issue number 1 has to be done before issue number 2, you would express that, as part of the priority. and basic, because the one of the agile principles, whatever you want to call it, is done means done. So and this is why you organize it into sprints, so you don't get partial credits. If you have a story or an issue that isn't done by the end of the sprint, it moves into the next sprint.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So there is no, in Microsoft Project, you have the ability to say, hey, this task has to be 100% done before this, and then everything would push out automatically, right? That's
Right.
you would have basically your timelines adjust automatically because certain tasks wouldn't get done, and then just route. Yeah, that functionality is not in the plan functionality in GitLab.
Okay, got it. And the reason why I point that sorry, go ahead.
Like you can make an issue and you can say this issue is blocked by this other issue, or this issue blocks this issue. So
Okay.
that it'll show up on the issue itself. I'm not sure where that would show in terms of the roadmap view. If there was
Got
like
it.
a
I think you can make epics also depend on each other, and it shows like a red something before the epic name on the roadmap view. But what would be
Got it.
nice is to see like an arrow that goes from the epic that's blocking the
Right.
other one to the next one, just a
And-
visual.
Yeah.
And another thing that you could do is create the iterations, and then you can also make the view through iterations, because some customers can have things moving out, but we just track like if it is the sprint itself. But each customer will adjust the naming, how they want to call it, sprint, iteration, or milestone.
Got it.
So then it's nice to define this when we start with each customer, and then we align on a name and work.
Yeah,
Right. And Brian, I brought this up because, as we work in multiple streams, prioritization doesn't work, because prioritization in one stream and the other stream and the other stream, you may have 3 priority ones in 3 different streams that have dependencies below them. So I was just looking for workarounds to that complexity. And it sounds like Brian May, I can't remember what you just used the term, but it's a block. It's blocked by. Is that correct?
Yeah. And
okay.
kudos to Glenn for raising it in the chat.
Yeah, so the
thanks,
plan functionality, as far as I understand it, and look, other folks that that are familiar can keep me honest here, but as far as I understand, it's super flexible. So there's really, I haven't come across a situation where I see like, wow, I couldn't do this, but there's the drawback. It's so flexible. For example, you need to be pretty clear about how to manage your labels, how you organize things into epics. You have to put some thought into that, but I haven't seen anything that you couldn't manage with plan. There's also one thing we didn't mention in the demo. There's lots of import and export functionality. You can import spreadsheets with all your tasks into issues, and there's all kinds of things you can do. But it's basically it's very flexible, and that by itself sometimes poses a challenge, because if you're not disciplined, what happens is you can end up with a little bit of a mess, and you have to clean things up. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. That was the short demo, and appreciate it. If you have questions after the meeting, feel free to ping us on Slack or email. And I think that basically concludes the recording.
I have one question, sorry, Brian.
One more question.
What's the difference between iteration and milestone?
Say again, iteration and
Milestone.
oh,
milestone.
So basically, I think I mentioned it in the presentation, that one slide. If you look at the, I think it's the last slide in the deck. Basically, a milestone is what we call a sprint or an iteration. So it's basically it's a way to define a time period in the plan functionality. And actually, I put the link into the handbook page that explains that as well. So there's basically a mapping of generally accepted terminology, like user story we call issues, task is a task list, Points, you sometimes hear, in Agile, they talk about story points. We call it weights. So
Yeah.
there's actually a handbook page that's in the presentation that you can look up. It's a mapping of terminology, but it really doesn't change.
No, I mean, because in GitLab itself, we have iterations and we have milestones. I'm not talking Scrum to GitLab, but in GitLab, we do have iterations as well.
So
And my
that-
understanding,
kind of aligned to sprints, right? And then milestones are more along
Releases.
the lines of like program. What our documentation says, program increments, right? But it's
Yeah.
larger groups of things. It may not be epics themselves, right? But it's larger things that need to be delivered over a longer period of time.
Yeah, you see, I'm just presenting. You see the screen?
Yes.
Am I presenting the right? Does it say milestones? I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
Yeah.
Milestones as
Yeah.
releases. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yep. So there is a boat. All this stuff is documented. So the handbook is actually pretty good at explaining it, because there is a certain mapping that we're doing from Agile parlance to GitLab speak, but the functionality basically is the same. And that's, by the way, when we do Jira to GitLab conversions, which we're worried about right now, that's basically one of the challenges that we have to, one, understand how to map, but then two, also do a little bit education with the customers that our terminology is slightly different.
Ryan,
But they're really minor. I mean, there's nothing major. It's not like, I mean, there's nothing you would like scratch your head like more than 2 minutes on.
yeah, so thank you. I like specifically that you are mapping the translation from GitLab to Jira, because it's quite interesting to make this navigation with the customer. And it's also being proactive, building up the project and showing them how we work. And then if they start to ask how we do on Jira, we can help them, but we also can show them how is the GitLab way of managing projects. So it was nice to just see this translation from Jira to GitLab. And we are working on it, so it was nice to see that everyone is going the same direction. I have been working on this with Zainab, so it was interesting to see that we are on the same page. Quite nice.
Yeah,
Thank
and
Thank you.
the final comment I would make, if you guys are engaged with customers that are using whatever Agile methodology, they sometimes feel passionate about their terminology. So when you come across a customer that talks about iterations and you start talking about sprints, they might be scandalized. But my point is, calm them down and explain that it's basically the same thing, right? So that's, I think, where the mapping is important. But people are very passionate about their terminology.
Some can be, and then these are the ones that we can just adjust also from our side. It's more about even showing them that GitLab can do the work that we use for Jira, for example. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
I can also add something about iteration versus milestones. The iterations are specific timeframes within a project where the work is planned, executed, and viewed. Okay, they can be thought as a series of smaller cycles or sprints, often using agile methodologies, right? And more specifically, milestones are used to group issues and merge requests all together based on a common goal, deadline, or event. So that could be like they are like in a broader scope compared to iterations, right? And they can encompass longer periods, if I can say so. So that could be the slight difference between milestones and iteration, but they serve, slightly different purposes.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Yeah, it's like releases and sprints, and I think in Agile in general, within a release, you would have a couple of sprints, and you have work assigned to each of the sprints. But at the end of the day, you are trying to deliver the release, which has the business value to the customer.
Exactly.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you all.
All right. Glenn, do I send you the link to the presentation and you can incorporate? I think you have like an ongoing running document with all the sessions and the information.
Yeah, you can send it to me, or
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Melanie asked for it too. So either one of us is
It's also
Yeah.
posted in the leaders channel.
Mhm.
Brian,
Yep.
cool. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time this morning.
All right.
great. Thanks, folks.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much. Now,
Thank you.
see
Bye.
you in the second round, or maybe not.
it. Round two. You bet. Bye.
Bye.
See you guys.
Look at that.
All right, welcome everybody. Second session of our Enablement Friday. I'm gonna share my screen and then we can get going. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk a little bit about Agile project management, sort of the basics of what's being done in general out there. And then we're gonna, talk a little bit about, oops. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
All right.
Way too many tabs. Yes, sir.
Yeah, don't get me started. It's Friday. That's why I have so many. On Monday, I always start with 0. So
Nice.
all right. So can you see presentation mode?
Yep.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about agile project management, sort of what's commonly done out there in the industry, and then also what we're doing with GitLab Plan. You guys might or might not have heard that actually there is another variant of the licensing option that we have. So for Ultimate, right now it's $99, and for $99 you get access to everything. Source code management, CI, security scanning, the plan functionality, the whole 9 yards. Really what's been happening in the market is that actually our dear friends from Jira are retiring what's called Jira Server, and that's one of their data center or self-managed based products. Not to be confused with Jira Data Center, which is actually a variant for the higher end of the marketplace that they're serving. But Jira, Atlassian Server is being end-of-lifed, EOL'd. And with that, we see an opportunity to basically contact existing Ultimate customers that are using Ultimate for their source code management and CI, and actually upgrade project managers, management staff, analysts, anybody who isn't touching code to a $15 license for the plan functionality. So that's actually out there. I think it's now general available. So it's sort of it's a license that will basically restrict you to simply use the plan functionality, not the source code management or the security scan or any of the other advanced functions that we have, specifically targeted at replacing Jira. So what we wanted to do is sort of walk you guys through just general concepts of what's going on in the market. There's really 2 things you need to separate. There's the tooling that's out there. We are one of the tools that provide basically agile management functionality, our plan functionality. Jira is a big player. They have huge following for their workflow system. They do a lot of agile management. They have different agile plugins. They have agile add-ons. They bought a company 2-3 years ago, which name escapes me, that are basically they're focused on basically putting stuff on top of Jira to enable safe specific constructs, allow for complex program and portfolio management, and roll up data and give you fancy graphs and charts. So there's all kinds of competitors out there. We just recently had a request to help a customer transition off their digital AI system, which is another workflow management system that's out there. So there's all kinds of activities going on, and that's why we're doing this. So agile project management, it all goes back to standard agile process systems, process methodologies. If that's Scrum, if that's Agile, there's like 4 or 5 popular ones out there. they all more or less do the same thing with variations. But what we wanted to do here is just go over the basics, so you sort of have that framework before we talk about the plan functionality. And Max is going to then do a short demo showing you basically how all this agile verbiage and agile terminology maps into our plan functionality. But the basics of agile iterative management is pretty straightforward. There's usually 5 steps. You plan your sprint, you do daily stand-ups, you refine your backlog, which is just a fancy to-do list of everything that you have to do for that sprint. And you'll see there's a product backlog, which is usually the big to-do list, and then a sprint backlog, which is a subset of that, and then you do sprint retrospectives. Now, all this is highly dependent on your environment, how complex your engagement or your development effort is. You might do 1-week sprints, you might do 4-week sprints, or anything in between. Generally, it's recommended to not do anything longer than 4 weeks because you lose sight of what's going on. Shorter sprints are harder to achieve because cycle times are faster. I've done everything in the past. Before I joined GitLab, I did sprints as little as daily, and as long as 4 weeks. So it really depends on your environment. It depends on your system setup. Depends on your business case as well. I always tell folks that iterating fast is great, but if your customer can't iterate with you, then sometimes you're basically out of sync. So I had that experience when we're basically delivering systems pretty quickly, and some of our customers were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You just integrated that into our data center. We don't want another version. So you have to just understand that there's a wide variety in terms of cycle times, what's acceptable. But generally, somewhere between a week and 4 weeks is sort of what's done there in the industry right now. What happens on all agile projects, if these are professional service projects, if these are software development projects, if these are other service projects that have nothing to do with software, you usually iterate along some key delivery objectives that you have, right? And so it's a couple of examples here. You might have a formal engagement step, or you need to go through extensive implementation planning, or you need to verify towards the end that you're actually achieving scaling and optimization goals. And then there's usually, for professional service, there's some kind of transition or handover process that happens. So again, all this is dependent on the complexity of your system. There's also sometimes sort of confusion about, oh my God, we're using waterfall, and how can you talk about sprints? Ultimately, waterfall, if you look at what waterfall does, it basically just closes a delivery funnel from fairly wide open when you're not quite sure what you're going to do, towards progressively getting smaller and smaller until you basically go into full launch and launch support. So if it's waterfall or not doesn't really matter. You can still iterate using sprints along those objectives to basically hit them and achieve your milestones. So I just wanted to point that out explicitly, because you sometimes get into these heated discussions like, we use this methodology or we use that methodology. And people get very much hung up on specific verbiage and specific key phrases that trigger them, and they're like, oh no, this is a milestone, it's not a sprint. And people get very passionate about that. So don't get all wrapped up around the axle on that. It's really just delivering to a long deliverable timeline in increments. And even if people say they're using waterfall, they're still more or less following that. Just that agile and a truly iterative approach that we're proposing, and that's part of GitLab's DNA, and that's part of GitLab's implementation philosophy. We iterate, right? That just helps you basically achieve smaller increments on a repeated basis and makes things more predictable. So when you look at an engagement, if that's a professional services or software development, you usually have 4 major sort of partitions. You basically go through some discovery phase. You go through, assembling a team. You go through, building a you basically start with, you know, what's commonly referred to a sprint zero, where you pull everybody together and you make sure you have the right staff, you understand the requirements, you have the systems to develop on, you have system access to networks, you open the right ports on your router, you have, you know, all kinds of other things in place. In the physical world, that might require you to have an office at the customer. In the virtual world, you might have to agree on, are you going to use Zoom or Teams or some other, you know, team collaboration software. And once all that is sort of agreed upon in sprint zero, you then basically start sprinting and start working on the deliverables. So pretty standard process, nothing really exciting here. Probably 80% of the industry out there does this nowadays. When you look at how things are organized, I always tell folks this is one of those cheat sheets I always recommend folks to have. It's really roles that deliver, events that happen, and then, you know, artifacts that you have to agree on. And the roles are the different project roles that people, you know, have. You know, they might be full-time, they might be part-time. They might be filled by GitLab personnel. They might be provided by partners. They might be actually provided by customers. Again, depending on the size and the complexity of the engagement or the project you're working on. There's usually a set of events. The common ones are sprint planning, daily stand-ups. Some companies do it daily. Some, you know, projects do it twice a week. Backlog refinement. So you have a big backlog of items that are prioritized, you know, according to complexity and business value. And you basically then pull out of that big backlog into your specific sprints the items that you want to accomplish for that time increment. Sprint reviews, if you have, usually what I recommend, if you have more than 3 sprints, meaning more than 3 to 6 weeks, you want to do sprint reviews to sort of have checkpoints in between while you deliver to see how well your sprints are going and if you're struggling with, you know, obstacles or not. If it's a real small deliverable that you're doing, say, you know, 4 weeks, then doing sprint reviews might not make sense. And it makes more sense to do a review at the end of the engagement or the end of the deliverable. And then basically retrospective, same thing. You want to basically look back and say, how can we actually improve our lives going forward? If it's a larger engagement with multiple sprints, retrospectives per sprint makes sense. If you don't, you know, then, you know, very often, you know, at the end of the engagement or the end of a deliverable, it makes sense to have a retrospective, you know, overall. Artifacts, you know, definition of done, you know, what does it actually mean to be done? There's always an interesting discussion. Every company is a little bit different. But, you know, one principle in all agile methodologies is basically you don't get credit for things that aren't done. So for example, if you have all the coding done, you implemented all the integration points, you tested it, you know it works, but it hasn't been signed off by the customer, you're not done. So I know this is sometimes hard because approval processes sometimes drag on and the work is done, but the approval hasn't been obtained. But, you know, it's basically a way of, it's a forcing function to basically, one, force those, you know, approvals to come in on time. And that's also something we can set expectations with the customers or the teams that we're working with to say, hey, you know, this is our definition of done. This is what we expect. Definition of ready is another one. So off the top of my head, I would say definition of ready, for example, there are probably sprint specific ones that you might want to consider, but for an engagement, for example, definition of ready is, do you have access to the network? Do you have access to, you know, certain artifacts that the customer wanted to provide to you? Is the system that we're supposed to install stuff on requisitioned and ready to go for us, right? So there is a readiness checklist depending on what you do that you want to call out, and again, make sure that the customer or the team that you're working with fully understands that. Then the product backlog, you should start any kind of sprint cycle with a backlog that has, you know, at least 2 to 3 sprints worth of work. If it's a large enough effort. If it's a teeny tiny effort and you can get things done in one sprint, then that's basically the backlog. In our case, for professional services, a lot of this is initially driven, I think, out of our statements of work, right? What comes out of the statement of work basically is sort of the initial set of activities that we need to start worrying about. But then it's also expected that you basically do further refinement and basically create more details out of that statement of work that comes from our engagement managers. A release plan if that's necessary, again depending on the size of the effort, and then of course weekly status reports. I always recommend to send status reports on the same day every week, so people get sort of into a cadence, and you can set expectations with the teams you work with, or with or with the customer. So this is really sort of just real quick breeze of how this works. Sprint zero, critical to basically create alignment. Now I'm so proud of this slide because it shows you what people think. So as you see early on in the sprint here, people are like confused and everybody has their own idea what's going on. And at the end, in the lower right corner, magically we're fully aligned. So really what this means is you have an opportunity in the first sprint, not just to present what your plan is and how you want to go about it, but you also have first time opportunity to work with team members you might not have met before, work through the expectations and create sort of a common understanding, which is really important. From a sprint zero foundation is really, it's really just a couple of steps here. You usually mobilize the team. You basically start with the engagement planning. You set up for technical and business foundations, what needs to be achieved. And then, ultimately, you prep for production readiness. What does it mean? So if you think about some of the engagements we do in terms of, migrations, for example, there's the process of actually going through the technical work of the migration, but then depending on customer size, there's probably also work involved where you need to actually peel off teams from the customer side to make sure that they can now actually, run operationally in the new environment that we're providing. So depending on the engagement, depending on this, on the project that you're engaged with, this might be, simple, 2 weeks you're done. It might be complex. So think some of the smaller engagements that we had versus some of the mega big ones like UBS, where we had many folks working on it, and it took a lot of sort of organizational change management approaches to getting things organized and get them up and running. So the nice thing about Agile in general, regardless what flavor you're using, if you're using SAFe, if you're using Scrum, if you're using any of the other flavors out there, the nice thing is it's a generalized process that is pretty much now industry standard. And that allows you to scale from relatively small, teeny tiny projects to really big projects. And there's also ways that you can basically layer hierarchical approaches. So Max is going to talk a little bit later about, epics and stories and how you can basically structure work in epics and show progress. So it's a flexible approach that you can take to basically organize your work regardless of the size of the engagement or the specific project you're working on. I let some of this you guys can read through afterwards. Really, it's just details. I want to get back a little bit to the cadence, which I think is important. And again, if you do this on a weekly basis or every 2 weeks, a lot of people have strong opinions. They want to have daily stand-ups. Other people are like, oh, it doesn't matter. Some people are like, it has to be in the morning. Others are like, we're working in many time zones, so we're gonna, pick a time slot during the day that works best for all the team members. But what's important is that you basically, from a best practice perspective, you go through a cadence and you repeat for as long as you're sprinting, because that basically starts providing predictability. It also, allows you to actually have metrics that are meaningful. Again, Max is going to show in a couple of minutes how some of the metrics actually, just by picking story points or weights, in GitLab plan, how that actually influences your burn downs, your, burn ups, burn downs, reporting. So the more you basically follow a cadence and you basically comply with all the things that you need to basically maintain from a sprint perspective in our issues, the easier this gets. Everything ultimately is driven out of the backlog. So I mentioned this before. The backlog is, nothing else but a big fancy to-do list. It's just a long list of issues. Now, out of that, backlog, excuse me, out of that backlog, you extract specific sprint items. So if you have, I'm just making up numbers, if you have 100 backlog issues and you have 5 sprints planned, roughly you're going to deal with about 20, items per sprint, assuming they all have the same complexity and weight, which usually is not the case. But, just so you understand, the big backlog ultimately is what you're driving towards accomplishing. Having said that, Agile assumes that while you are implementing things, while you're configuring things, while you're basically implementing, functionality and providing business value, that you might discover new issues, and they might add to the backlog, or you might also discover that certain assumptions that you had made early on are no longer valid and you don't have to implement them. And the same applies. So your backlog is not an absolute fixed list that you have to accomplish. A backlog is more a guidance. You pull out the most important and prioritized items for the next sprint. You implement those, then you go back to the backlog, you do more refinement, you pull out again into the next sprint. So it's a very, very flexible way of actually iterating towards a goal. And that's simply based on the fact that you do not always know what you have to implement 100% early on in the cycle. So if you have a delivery window of 3 months, let's just say, 2-week sprints, so you have roughly 6 sprints in that 3 months time period, you will not know early on what you all will encounter basically towards the end. And that's, this approach basically gives you flexibility. It also, because you're iterating every couple of weeks, if that's 1 or 2 week cycles, it basically gives you an opportunity to level set with the customer. If that's, a paying customer, or if that's just a stakeholder, or if that's even with your team, to say, hey, we accomplished this, but things changed. Now we have to basically level set and adjust. And so it's a very flexible approach, but it's all driven out of the backlog. So the better you maintain your backlog, the better you document the things that are most important, the better you're going to do on the delivery side. And again, so the things implicit in the backlog is that high priority items are at the top of the backlog. Just like our GitLab plan functionality, when you look at our issues as well as our boards, you can drag them up and down, to basically indicate priority. It's implicit in the UI, but you can basically drag things up and down the list to indicate how important it is. And the agreement is really that folks always work on the most important items on top of the list first. So they don't start working at the bottom of the list, because usually what's at the bottom of the list is least important. So also in terms of details, you usually have the top of the list more detailed in terms of documentation, issue documentation, technical analysis. Maybe you group issues into epics, and that's because you focus on those high priority items first. The lower priority items might literally sometimes just be placeholders. So keep that in mind. So that's really the approach. Next up, so when you use an agile approach, and again, we were able to do this fully in the GitLab plan functionality, you prioritize on one side. So things on top are more important than things at the bottom in your backlog, if that's the product backlog or the sprint backlog. But you also try to front load business critical things in the early sprints. So you actually deliver things that are important to the business early, which might be a challenge, but then you have time to iterate over those and make them actually work. Low priority items you leave in the backlog at the bottom, and they usually get scheduled into the sprint cycles more towards the end of the delivery cycle. And the reason that's a deliberate choice in Agile is because especially business users frequently, when they go through a 8 or 10 or 12 week implementation cycle, towards the end, they realize that some of the things that might have been asked for early on in the cycle aren't that important. And actually, I've seen that many times on projects that I was on, that the business owners towards the end would be like, don't worry about it, we don't need that. So you literally, because you had that prioritization early on in terms of, first prioritizing what's most important in the sprint, but also delivering the most important business value item in early sprints. Those two prioritization mechanisms very often identify sort of the low value items on a list. And people are like, don't bother, don't have to do that any longer. Especially on time and materials contracts, I've seen that dynamic, that people basically are running out of money. And if you get them involved in this prioritization process, it's very often the customer who's like, okay, we're done. Well, we basically are running out of money. This is good enough. We can live with this. So just keep that in mind. It's a fairly dynamic way of project management, but it's also now more and more pretty openly accepted. There are a couple of examples here. Don't have to go through this. That just sort of mentions the ABCs and how you do this. The last slide I wanted to highlight before we sort of get into the demo is and this is going to be shared. The link is going to be shared to the presentation. So the last slide here is really it points to our handbook, and there is a mapping that happens from basically the agile industry speak to GitLab speak. And literally, so I talked about user stories. For us, those are issues: tasks, task lists, epics, map to epics, points. When you hear story points or point estimation mentioned, we call that weights. So there's certain things that are just different. When you see like agile boards, we call them issue boards, but they're exactly the same. So it's just a different terminology. So don't get discombobulated when you see a term. You're like, oh my God, we don't have that. It's just the mapping. So want to make sure and so Ian, I know from a technical instruction perspective, when we do training, I'm sure that we run across people that have whatever Scrum or SAFe certifications, and they might be very opinionated about, oh no, it's called an iteration, it's not a sprint, right? So but it's really just terminology. There is no difference in functionality. So having said that, that's basically sort of just the agile overview. So I'm going to hand it over to Max, who's gonna walk us through basically a hands-on demo, just to sort of show you guys real quick what's actually in the product. By the way, I mentioned that we now have this $15 add-on for the plan functionality. There has been a lot of focus on that, just to take advantage of the end of life announcement that came out for Atlassian Server. But there's going to be additional focus going forward on building out the plan functionality more than what we have right now, including simplification of the migration process from Jira into GitLab. So there's lots of things cooking right now. So this is just sort of to get everybody up to speed on where we are today. So I'll hand it over to Max.
Okay. I guess everybody can see my screen now. Everyone, in this small demo, I will showcase the mapping that Brian was just talking about. So how we can actually use the GitLab plan functionality to actually manage agile projects. For this specific use case, we're gonna go with a project called Taskmaster. It is just a project that I actually created to manage tasks easily, if I can say so. It's like just a small project to help organize tasks in a simple manner. With that being said, let's start with the first functionality, which is roadmaps. So the roadmaps gives you an overview of the project in the long term. So let's say, for example, we want to craft this specific product. We have a set of epics, which defines what we call our roadmap. And these epics will basically be our point in time to see how good we're going with the project, what is the percentage of completion of the epics, and so forth and so on. So a roadmap, as I said, is just a list of epics. And what is an epic, basically? An epic is basically like a mix of multiple epics and issues. So you can actually have child epics that you can see here, child epics or issues that could be associated to a specific epic. And the epic defines what we call a big chunk of work that has to be done as part of the project, basically. So whenever we create these epics, we just need to assign them a start date and a due date. And that will basically, draw that specific roadmap that you saw on the last screen. In this specific case, I created an epic and I create 2 child epics. So one for the backend development and one for the front-end development. And I basically associated like different issues to these small epics. So let's say we go, for example, in one of the issues. An issue, as Brian was saying, is basically like a user story. A user story is like, it's like a feature that we want to implement at some point. Okay, so it's not that different from a GitLab perspective. You can just give it a name, a description. You can also add comments to the story. You can actually have comments the same way we actually have comments in merge requests and stuff like that. You can assign the story to specific people. You can also link it to a specific epic. So in this case, it's actually a link to the backend development epic. You can label the stories in order to make sure you can sort them out easily later on. And you can assign to these specific stories what we call milestones. A milestone, from a GitLab standpoint, is like a sprint in the agile project management and stuff like that. And when you go into a specific milestone, you might get track of all the tasks that have been implemented as part of the sprint. Here you can see that there is a Gantt chart, even though in this case, we don't have any specific graph. I have a specific milestone here, for example, this one, the one that is actually in the current sprint. So for all the specific tasks that are going on in the sprint, you can actually keep track of the task using the issue weight that we call story points. So in this case, for example, you can see this specific story it's a 5-point story. This one is a 4-point story. It's the same kind of, the same kind of language, right? It's just that GitLab has a specific dictionary to actually depict this kind of things. Now that you have basically issues and stuff like that, let's talk about issue boards. So an issue board, it's like, for those who are familiar with Kanban or any other agile methodologies, you can actually see that this looks like a Kanban board, right? So you can basically move stories from one status to another one. You can basically just update the story. Let's say, for example, you want to change who is assigned to a story. You can also add specific things like a file, or let's say, for example, you want to change the labels. You want to also change the due date and stuff like that. You can do it directly from the issue board. Now, what is interesting about the issue board is that you can basically customize it to your specific needs, right? So in this specific case, we decided to go with a classic framework in Agile project management. You can see that stories can go from the in progress state, they can go into review, into done. We can add as much list as we want, so we can actually define another step here. It also depends on what is our definition of done, right? So we can actually define all of this based on specific metadata. You can actually go by label, by assignee, or by milestone. So you can also have multiple boards. You can create a new board that could basically, let's say, for example, track issues by criticality. I can call it risk board. So when you create the board, you can just basically just switch to it, right? And you basically have all the issues there. And then you can actually just create your list and see, okay, you want to sort your issues based on the risk, right? So for example, you want to see the issues that are high risk and so on and so forth. So so once this specific issue board is actually, done depending on your needs as a team, right? You can basically, in a story, let's say, for example, you have a story that requires some kind of development work, you can also associate a merge request to a specific story so that once the development work that has to be done as part of the story is done, you can actually just, create a CI/CD pipeline that's actually just validating all the changes and can actually close the issue at the same time. So it really depends on what kind of framework you want to implement. What is because GitLab is basically extremely flexible, so you can basically adapt it to any kind of projects. So the last feature that I wanted to talk about is called wikis. So wikis represent a way to document whatever you have in a specific project. So in this specific case, you can see at the end of the sprint, for example, you can do a retro, as Brian was saying. So in the retro, you can basically document anything that you talk about during the retro call. You can talk about achievements, challenge faced, what went well, what didn't went well exactly, the things that we can improve, and what are the different action items. You can basically document everything as part of wikis. So from this specific standpoint, you can actually see that GitLab is flexible enough to adapt to pretty much anything you want to implement as part, of a Jira board, or I don't know what kind of background you have, maybe using another agile project management tool. But basically, GitLab has no limitation. That like there's no specific things that you can do in these tools that you can do with GitLab. So that concludes the small demo that I had, and I hand it over to you so that you can actually ask any questions you have. So, yeah.
Any questions, folks?
Do you want the hardball?
Sure.
So how do I take my organization from our Confluence and Jira integration over to GitLab? What's your recommended approach?
Yeah, so a couple of things that we're working on, our product team is working on. So here's the challenge that we have right now. So and actually this is a general challenge. So for example, if you look at our documentation, how to import, export Jira data and get it set up in GitLab plan for one project, that sort of works, right? The problem is when we deal with customers that have like 500 projects, that's when things go crazy. And as you well know, Mike, there's some things that when we move things from Jira into GitLab, it doesn't work so well. So what we're doing right now, our product team is actually looking at a open source product that's out there to basically programmatically be better able to move projects from Jira into GitLab plan. But the real complex challenge I think that we're facing is that with the Atlassian end of life announcement, it's not just Jira. So people always confuse that, right? It's Jira, it's Confluence, it's Crucible, which is I think a code review tool. There's like 5 or 6 tools that are impacted by this Atlassian server end of life announcement. And from what I've seen in a previous life, and I think Mike, you probably have seen the same thing, a lot of our customers use Jira and Confluence and plugins for, Jira that give, additional functionality. So, because it's complex and there is no one-to-one feature by feature move that we can do, really the recommended approach right now is to take, for larger organizations, to basically do this through a change management process where you basically let projects accomplish a certain milestone in Jira, then you cut them over into GitLab plan and they start with a new increment or a new sprint or a new project release, whatever their granularity is. They start anew in GitLab. But right now we as a company do not have a clear, elegant feature by feature migration approach. So it's quite messy. I just had a discussion today with one of our partners at Finis. They actually have a partner that has fairly complex Jira, infrastructure in place. They understand that this is not an easy lift, so they're willing to work with us to gain experience. So we're looking at, between our product engineering guys that are working on the open source tool that's available, us on the practice management side, and at Finis and the customer, how we can potentially, partner up to do some, real world trial on what works and what doesn't work so well in terms of transitioning a complex Jira customer into GitLab plan.
Awesome.
I'm not sure how awesome it is, but that's where we are. So I'd be
I already
happy.
knew the answers. I was just, I
Yeah.
can't let you guys go away without any questions. And there's
No, totally valid. No, and look, so by the way, so I think this is my repeated, this is my mantra. Anybody who listens to me is going to hear this sooner or later. So individual problems, if you give me Jenkins, right, I can give that to Max or you, Mike, or to Leopard and say, hey, look at this Jenkins file, implement, our GitLab CI. And I know you guys are going to be able to do that, right? The problem is, once I have 12,000 Jenkins files, now suddenly the approach doesn't work any longer. So in an instance by instance case, one Jira project, okay, one Jenkins file, okay, but our problem is scale, especially because we're focusing on enterprise customers now. So I think that's basically the learning process we're going through with our product engineering teams, trying to create awareness there that just having some functionality that does one single instance doesn't really help us. We need to be able to do this 1,000 times and also need to do it cost effectively. Otherwise,
right.
Customers aren't interested. We price ourselves out of the game.
Yep.
So, any other questions? Going once, going twice.
Great.
All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, I will stop the recording.